The Salinity committee meeting today. Happy to have you all here. I think we have a nice full agenda. Hopefully you all have a chance to review that, but I'll just, maybe we do a round of introductions and then keep going. I'll just start since I'm talking anyway. I'm Ben Stireman with the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. And
I'm Ryan Rowland with the U.S. Geological Survey.
Christine Rumsey, U.S. Geological Survey.
I'm Jennifer Bates with Forestry, our statements.
And Jeff Denblaker with Jacobs, facilitating.
Clark Reynolds, U.S. Magnesium.
Joe Hannessy, Compass Minerals.
John Lott, Wildlife Resources.
Thomas Bill Steele's Brancham Cooperative.
just want to get back here.
Bill Berm, Brancham Cooperative.
Elliot Jagnicki, Utah Geological Survey.
Ryan Doherty, Cargill.
Tim Locks, Brancham Cooperative.
Laura Vernon, Water Resources.
Ben Holcomb, Water Quality.
Ginger Freitas, Friends of Great Salt Lake.
I'm Ryan Bartlett with Compass Minerals.
Great. Well, thank you. And then let's see online. I see we got Rob Dubuque, Friends of Great Salt Lake, Marissa Weinberg with Forestry, Fire, and State. Oh, I thought I saw her here. With Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, Layla Amati with Water Resources, and Jim Harris with DWQ, Jake Srago with Water Resources, and is that everybody online? All right. Great. Well, thank you everybody for being here. We've got like Ben said, we've got a full agenda here. Just to give you just a quick overview here, number of updates that we want to do just on lake conditions like we typically do. An update on the Berm protocol, management protocol. Christine has a really great presentation, just an update on the work that she and others have been doing on salinity data from the lake. And then I think in terms of new topics, wanted to, I guess, do a little bit of housekeeping on our salinity and density standard operating procedure document. I sent that out to the salinity community members with some suggested changes to update that. And then I wanted to, I guess, talk about the Berm management protocol, not in that we're going to revise that right now, but what just in light of the conditions that we have, I guess I want to start thinking about what we want to do later this summer, what kinds of data that we want to do. And I think, Phil, did you have some data that we look at? One of the things we talked about at the last meeting was just, how, and, the SOP talks about how we measure salinity and how we calculate that. But what we started talking about at our last meeting was where we measure salinity. And so, we've got a long record of salinity data, and we started talking about, well, is there a different depth that we might want to start adding that to our list of areas that we measure, so we can track that as well. And Phil has taken a look at their data sets, and he's going to give us a look at what the comparisons that they've been doing. And then want to just close out with some action items. We can go forward and talk about our next meetings. So I guess back here, we already done introductions. I just realized I don't think I sent the meeting summary out this last week to you, but I sent it out a couple of months ago. I don't know if you all had a chance to look at that when I sent that out. It's part of the package with just reviewing the protocol document and getting your approval on that. Did anybody have any comments on, if you can recall, on that? Come on, John, you remember that. I can't remember my name.
Go Aces.
We maybe just want to send it out after this and then review on our next meeting, make sure everybody's comfy with what it says.
Let's do that. So any other things that we want to talk about, I guess, on the agenda today? All right, I guess then we can jump to the update on lake conditions. I'm assuming this was the file.
Yeah. So we'll tag team as usual. So we'll go over lake elevation and some discharge and velocity data at the new breach. Christine will then jump in with salinity information. Next slide. All right, so lake surface elevation for the south arm. So here's data for our salt air gauge, showing data from roughly October of 2019 through the current period here. You see the very nice rise in water level elevation, water surface elevation, beginning in mid to late November through the current period. So as of yesterday, we were at 4193.1 feet. So we're up about 4.6 feet since the low in November of 2022. So recall we have a berm that's been raised to 4192 out there. So that's been in play and contributing to this rapid rise that we see in the south arm. So it's always important to keep that in mind as we look at water surface elevation data. Next slide, please. So lake surface elevation for the north arm. Same period of record shown on the plot. The most recent data, it's obvious we don't see as much of a rise at this site. As of yesterday, the average daily value was 4189.4 feet. So we're up about 9/10 of a foot since November, the low in November of 2022. And this would be a good thing for the group to discuss thoughts on why we're not seeing much of an increase at this site. I mean, obviously the berm is in play, but the current elevation on the south arm is allowing for spilling over the berm. So it'll just be something that would be good to discuss with the group to get thoughts on when we'll see more of a response, or why we see things kind of leveling out. If you look at that most recent data, you see how there's just not much increase, and maybe even a slight decrease over the last few weeks. Next slide, please. All right, some really, really good news for Great Salt Lake. So let's just look at the cumulative flow in millions of acre feet for our major gauges, major inflow gauges. So this is the Bear River near Corinne, Utah. The bold black line is the current year of data. So the x-axis shows a water year, so October through September of the following year. The blue is the highest ever measured cumulative flow. The green zone is 25th to 75th percentile, and there's a faint gray line in the middle of the green zone. That's the median cumulative flow. And then the yellow line is the lowest ever measured cumulative flow. Bold black line, really nice slope on that line since February. And currently it's on an upward trajectory, which is fantastic. We're just above the median right now for Bear River, Corinne. And we expect we've got more snow to move downstream past this gauge. So it'll be really fun to watch how this gauge plays out the rest of the year. Water year. Next slide, or hit the next button. Okay, same kind of plot for our Farmington Bay outflow gauge. Bold black line is above the blue. So this is currently, we have, for this day of the year, we have the highest ever cumulative flow up to this point in the water year. So fantastic news for Great Salt Lake. And again, that y-axis is cumulative stream flow in millions of acre feet. Next slide. Or just next, yeah. Weaver River near Plain City, Utah. The black line has a fantastic looking steep slope that started in late February, early March. We're above the 75th percentile, and we know there's more water to come downstream. So it'll be fun to see where we end up at this site in terms of the historic record. Next. And then Goggin Drain. An important site for Great Salt Lake inflows. The bold black line is just above that faint gray line, the median, and nice looking slope. So healthy flows at this site as well. Next slide. Okay, so we're measuring discharge at the breach, the new breach. You've seen this plot many times. So we have discharge in cubic feet per second on the left axis. We have elevation difference between the south and the north arms of the lake on the right y-axis. The blue circles are measured discharge, physically measured discharge values. Blue is south to north, red is north to south, and then the elevation difference is the gray line on the plot. And I'm showing data from about July 2021 out through the most recent data, which was collected in early May. And also with vertical dash lines are indicating when the berm, recent adjustments to the berm. And so obviously from July 2021 out to August or late July of 2022, north to south flows were relatively high. But then the berm was raised, and you see those blue dots just dive right down. The red dots also go to near zero or zero after the berm was raised to 4187. So very low flows, both flow directions from August 2022 out to when the berm was raised again in February of 2023. So we did have some significant flows building up just before the berm was raised, around 700 CFS going from south to north. But then the berm was raised to 4192. You see how the flows have dropped off significantly. We don't really have any north to south flows since the berm was raised. The data we've collected are very noisy. But we do see with the blue dots after the berm was raised some recent upticks in flows. I think the last measurement there was 130 CFS. Maybe it was 140 CFS. I have to double check. But this represents the fact that the south arm elevation is now above the top of the berm, and there is now some robust flow over the top, relatively robust flow over the top of the berm. So that's the situation with discharge. And you note the huge elevation difference between the south and the north arms with the gray line, over 3.5 feet. Next slide, please. We have uplooker velocity sensors at the breach. So on the plot, I'm showing data from the existing or the old Sontec ADCP that's measuring 10 different locations in the water column. On this plot, I'm only showing one of the depths, and it's at an elevation of 4186.6 feet. And I'm showing data from March of this year out to the current period. And so the area that's blued out there, that sensor was basically impacted by salt crust on the sensor itself. So the data were erroneous. And then you can see in early April, the data time series begins with the orange line. And that, if you were to draw a line through that kind of a median line, you'd see there's an uptick, small uptick in velocities. And these are not big velocities. So this is the zero line. So right now we're up to 0.2, maybe to 0.4 feet per second velocities out at the new breach. So the other piece of news for the uplooker uplooker velocity effort, we've installed the new Nortec ADCP. We did that, installed that on April 19th. This is measuring, right now it's set to measure 50 different locations in the water column. We can increase that up or down. We don't have that data piped to the web yet, and I don't have any data to show you here today, but next meeting we'll talk a lot more about data from this new unit. That's it for my part of the update. If there are any questions.
Is there, I can't hardly see, is there a little bit of north to south slosh or anything? Because we, at least when we sampled yesterday, there's a tiny brine layer, not much, but I'm wondering if that's slosh back in.
Yeah, I think we've seen some flow reversals in this velocity data with the old Sontec due to wind events. Yes, we've seen that for sure. Yeah, if we get a strong north wind event, we've seen north water. I don't know if we've seen it recently, but after the berm was raised, not long after the berm was raised to 4192, we did see some events where water would spill from north to south.
It's not that much, but there seems to be a little bit right at the bottom. So
Yeah, there's a big head difference there, 3.5 feet, but we get big events, big waves that are able probably to crash over that berm from the north to the
You
south.
see that consistently along different sites that you measured, or
So this was mostly in the North Basin. So that's why I think it's sloshing over into that. It was only at a couple sites over there, but it's not on like it's going over the sill or anything, and it's not that much. So just a little bit.
We've seen something similar at our site up in the northwest area. Very thin and not nearly as saline as it used to be.
Yeah.
So it has me wondering whether it's actual North Arm water or whether it's water that's been there for a while but just hasn't had a chance to mix down in. Because that'll create the stratification and result in some of that hydrogen sulfide too.
Yeah, the reason I was bringing this up is because, was thinking we kind of shut the deep brine layer down, and I hadn't, or at least the crew hadn't mentioned this before yesterday. So I was like, I don't know that that's resident. It has been sitting there where it is recent.
Hey, Brian, any thoughts as to why this North Arm is declining?
No.
Anybody have any thoughts?
I mean, we've got evaporation now working kind of against lake level increases, so that's definitely a factor. But
Yeah, that's what I was going to say is right about now, you're going to start seeing evaporation rate pick up in earnest, and that could overcome the inflow rate. Not criticizing the berm, but it's not a flat berm. It's kind of like a V-notch weir to some degree. So there's only, 50 feet of actual flow out of 150 feet.
Are you pumping into your west ponds already, or I don't know?
Nominally.
So that's not
Like, yeah, it's like a tenth of the capacity.
The breach was closed for several years, or 3 years when they were doing the construction on it. What was the maximum elevation difference during that period?
I think
About this?
I think pretty close. Yeah, unfortunately, that's funny you asked that question because usually I have a slide that shows that period of record when I show the discharge measurements. I can look that up. I think it was 3.5 to 4 feet. I think we're in the same range.
Yeah, when I say nominally, it's like 1 or 2.
All right, well, thanks.
That's
but
Okay.
this is a normal.
what is one about flow?
Next.
probably 10,000.
Now we'll just talk about our most recent salinity data.
It's 20, but we don't have the hydraulics.
You've seen this plot before, salinity versus time, just put everything into context, showing data from 2565 and 3510, so the north and south basins. And I guess just kind of focus on our most kind of recent observations. We had our high about 185, 186 in the fall. We've just seen a consistent decrease in salinity over that time, consistent with UGS measurements, as well as measurements at Saltaire and at the new breach. So USGS actually was out on the lake on April 26th, and that's the most recent salinity measurement we have for 3510 and 2565 at a shallow depth. And at Gilbert Bay, the 3510 site, we were measuring 144 grams per liter, and at 2565 in the North Basin, 126 grams per liter. And April 10th was the last GSLEP set of measurements we have, which includes data at 0.5 meters below surface, 3 meters below surface, and at our kind of half a meter above bottom. And I'll kind of show that on the next slide. So unfortunately, we were not able to measure the salinities the samples that were just collected a couple days ago.
Yeah, they would probably be just below 120 grams per liter. Yeah,
Okay.
according to what they.
Yeah, cool. We're excited to see what that shows. Saltaire on May 9th, we measured 141 grams per liter. UGS on May 3rd measured 129 to 135 grams per liter. And then at the new breach on May 3rd, so same time UGS was at Saltaire, we measured 108 grams per liter. So we're really seeing a fresh, that the North Basin is fresher, confirmed by samples at 2565 and at the new breach. So really seeing a kind of a nice shallow plug of water at the new breach that is quite fresh moving into the north. So, next slide. And then if we zoom in on the last couple of water years, you guys have all seen this, just to put things into more recent context. The fall of 2021, our highest measurements were 168. Last fall, we got up to 185. And again, our most recent set of measurements on April 10th, shallow salinities were 142 to 155. If we compare those from last fall to now, April 10th, I guess, sorry, seeing a change of about 30 grams per liter in Gilbert Bay and 44 grams per liter decrease at 2565, the North Basin. But again, as John alluded to, those are probably low, given that salinities have gone down since April 10th. And then if we look a little bit closer at the April 10th samples, our shallow 0.5 and 3 meters at 3510 and Gilbert Bay, both were 155 grams per liter. So we didn't see any vertical gradient there at that site at that time. At 2565, we did. So the shallow half meter above bottom sample was 142 grams per liter, whereas the 3 meter below surface was 153 grams per liter. So did see a difference there. And these, there maybe the deep layer, we didn't see evidence of a deep brine, but probably the deep samples were like 5 grams per liter higher, just to give you a little idea. So some gradient there. Next slide. And then this is the last slide I have. I wanted to just start to help us understand spatial variability in these 4 GSLEP sample sites. So these are just shallow salinities, and I'm starting from last September, kind of those September, October, November, and then January through April. So in the fall, first thing you can tell is that we're freshening across the lake from fall to now. And also in the fall, we see much more homogeneity in the salinities, the surface salinities. Then when we started to see fresh water coming in, we begin to see a little bit of variability across the south arm, especially at 2267 where the Bear River comes in, and also at 2767, which is where Farmington Bay outflow is. So just to give you all an idea of how we see variability, I'll continue to build these throughout the season, and I'm curious to see when we see it to be, we see it well mixed again. This year might be a little bit different than other years, but that's about all I have. Any questions?
You want to take?
Do you want to go to the other agenda item? I'm happy to keep going, but.
Oh, yes.
Not much of an update for the protocol. We appreciate the recommendations from the committee, and we've been going through review and kind of doing all of our diligence items to be able to adopt that. We're contemplating being able to adopt that now without any changes. So we're very happy with the way the recommendation was written. And I think that the main update is that what we're planning to do is we will most likely adopt it as is, knowing that this is an interim protocol. And I think this year will be interesting to see if there's, how things level off and whether a modification will even be necessary, if levels actually level out. But we are going to be starting our comprehensive management plan soon, and we're hoping that with the April deadline to have a new, more robust protocol, that we would officially adopt a protocol as an appendix to our comprehensive management plan. So that's how we're seeing this moving forward. But for now, we're working on adopting the recommendation as is.
Any questions on that? I guess thank you all, because that took a lot of effort to get the protocol developed and then approved. So it's great to have that getting into place. So I guess if not, we can get back to you.
Okay, cool. Okay, so we kind of gave an update of this probably, 6 months ago or something, but we have a few more findings, and we're getting super close to a complete draft on this work. And it was originally started as a Forestry for St. Lands Hot Topics grant, and then it kind of ballooned into a monster. So this is work that myself, Scott Henick, and others that our office have been working on, as well as we've roped in folks from UGS, Utah State, Division of Water Resources, and Phil from the Friendship Cooperative. So I'll kind of give you quick version of our recent findings. So go ahead, Jeff. Our key study objectives, to kind of orient everyone to what we're trying to do here, was to kind of collate all of our data, salinity data, profile data, into what we call a data release that is publicly available to everyone on the web. And we also have verified the existing equation of state. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but just know that we were able to collect samples in 2021 and 22. We validated the existing equation of state, which allows us to measure a density and a temperature and compute an estimated salinity. And those data will also be published in the data release. And then the three main objectives I'm going to talk about today will be summarized in a journal article, and they are calculating the salt mass in the upper and deep layers of the south arm, kind of figuring out how salt is partitioned in the south arm, understanding salt mass fluctuations over time, and then estimating salt mass exchange across the causeway, as well as salt loading from rivers. So next slide. And just to put everything into context, we all know that the causeway has significantly altered the water and salt balance of the Great Salt Lake. And there's been a number of modifications made to the causeway and its openings over time. This is a nice plot that Ryan prepared. So we're looking at lake water surface elevations for north and south arms from 1985 to present. So over here would kind of be that lakeside breach being constructed at the high stand in the 80s, 1984. And then you can see a series of modifications have been made to the lakeside breach in 96 and around 2000. And then we get into the more recent era where we have the culverts closing, the new breach opening, and then berm modification. So if you toggle one more, Jeff, this is our period of analysis, is roughly the last 12 years, covering three different kind of berm paradigms, breach or causeway paradigms, management paradigms. So when the culverts were open, when they were closed, and then when West Crack was open. So, and also I start to use West Crack as an equivalent to New Breach. That's kind of what we call it affectionately at USGS. So sorry, those are the same things. But just to give you an idea, we're covering kind of multiple periods of causeway paradigms here. Next slide. And we kind of rope in a ton of different data. As you all know, we partner with state agencies to monitor salinity through a number of different programs. Our kind of gold star standard data set that we like the best, because it has monthly data, is the GSLIP, the 4-site GSLIP network. So these salinity data are really key and are the backbone to this whole analysis. They're kind of hard to see, but you're probably familiar with where they are, all in the South Arm. We're also roping in data from 7 Division of Water Quality sites where we sample twice per year in June and October. And then we rope in data from the Saltaire gauge down at the south end of the lake, at West Crack, where we collect salinity data roughly every 8 weeks, Lakeside Breach when it's flowing every 6 weeks, and also we use data from the Utah Geological Survey, which their sites are sampled 1 to 3 times per year. So we're basically just trying to say, okay, we have all these different monitoring programs. How are salt mass estimates affected by these different data sets? Can they tell us something about the robustness of our ability to estimate salt mass, and are they interchangeable? Are they kind of overlapping? So next slide. So using the 4-site Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program salinity data, we computed South Arm dissolved salt mass in millions of tons. So that's shown here as these dots in blue, that's South Arm. And then because we wanted to really kind of start to learn about why we see fluctuations in South Arm, we also worked with Andrew and Elliot and they computed North Arm dissolved salt masses for us to just kind of see how these are related over time. And again, we're looking from 2010 to July of 2022. And I should mention that our study period ends on July 27th, 2022. The subsequent day, the berm was raised. And so our period of study kind of precedes that modification. But what we can learn from this is that there have been, many fluctuations in South Arm salt mass. In 2011, we had a big water year, a lot of flow moving from south to north. We exported salt, see an increase in North Arm dissolved salt mass, and then it kind of re-equilibrates again. When culverts are closed, we see a kind of a gradual decline. And Jeff, if you want to click one more, I think there's some arrows there. Yeah. And then, of course, when West Crack was opened in December of 2016, we saw a really large magnitude kind of step down in South Arm dissolved salt mass. And then what Phil Brown brought to everyone's attention a couple of years ago and kind of caught the attention of this group was this increase in salt mass of the South Arm from roughly, the fall of 2017 to present. And so this is us kind of just getting a bird's eye view of how these changes have been happening and how they relate to the North Arm. So often, when we see decreases in South Arm, that corresponds with an increase in North Arm, suggesting there's this connectivity of exchange, but not always. Okay, so next slide. And then we dug into the South Arm and just asked, okay, well, where is the salt in the South Arm? So we quantified salt in the upper brine layer and then layers below what we're calling chemocline and Carrington Bay in red and then in Gilbert Bay in orange. And if you click one more, Jeff, what we see is that there's variability, the amount of salt that's held below the chemocline, which is largely the same as the deep brine layer, but there are periods of time when we have big freshwater inflows and we do see a salinity gradient in the South Arm that is that still develops a chemocline. But so we use this general term just to make that clear. It's dynamic. The mass held below the chemocline is dynamic through time, really corresponding with when culverts were opened or closed or when there were openings through the causeway. We see the mass is below the chemocline when there are openings in the causeway, and when they were closed, we saw that disappear. And then most recently, if you click one more time, what's interesting is that we saw this decline in the mass held below, salt mass below the chemocline, likely what we're hypothesizing due to low lake levels, and many others have hypothesized the same thing, that we just kind of, wind energy is now able to mix further in the water column to kind of mix out that deep brine layer as lake levels go down. So next slide. And to assess our estimates of salt mass in the South Arm upper brine layer, we kind of threw the kitchen sink at it using all these different data sets. That's what's shown here is the difference in mean monthly upper brine layer salt mass from 2010 to present for all these different data sets. And all the data sets are compared to the 4-site Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program network. So as you can see, what's really encouraging about this is that most of the time, these mean monthly salt mass estimates fall within 10% of the GSLEP. So that means like if GSLEP collects a set of samples at their 4 sites in a given month, and we collect one at Saltaire, there's a really good likelihood that Saltaire does just as good of a job at estimating South Arm salt mass in the upper brine as this 4-site GSLEP network. That just gives us confidence in our ability to estimate salt mass, as well as gives us some redundancy. So if we miss a sampling out on the lake, we have kind of backup data sets that we can still use. And what we quantified is that, within 8%, that 95% of the time, all of these data sets are within 8% of the GSLEP 4-site estimate. So pretty encouraging that way. Okay, and this is kind of getting into the meat of it. So we've documented this change. We've documented how salt is partitioned in the South Arm. And we really wanted to try and dig into why this South Arm salt mass was increasing during the period of 2017 to the present. And so the data sets we bring to bear on this question are looking at what's coming in via the river inflows, what's being exchanged at West Crack, both from south to north and north to south, and what is leaving via lakeside. So these are the kinds of things we have data on, we can actually quantify. And so we took an attempt to do that and just see if we can account for everything. So if you go to the next slide, what we started off doing was calculating a daily salt flux. So this is basically saying how much mass passes a given site in a given day. So units are in millions of tons per day. And from fall of 2017 to the present, this plot is from December of 2016 to the present. And we quantified south to north flux using monthly discharge estimates from USGS. As you can see, those are kind of the dots, and we kind of connect them, computing salt mass or salt flux on a given day and kind of computing the spaces in between. So south to north, salt mass moving from south to north is in blue, salt mass moving from north to south. So being imported into the South Arm is in kind of this red salmon color. Lakeside, so that's another export right here, what's going out on the west end of the lake into the north. That's shown in purple. And then the river inflows are shown in blue. So what we learn right away is that most of the action is happening at West Crack. These are the largest salt fluxes out of any that we're able to quantify. And we also learned that the greatest export of salt from south to north occurs with a rise in South Arm Lake elevations, which is shown in this gray line and corresponds to that axis on the right. So when we have an increase in lake level in the south, you might expect we get a greater salt flux both at West Crack and at Lakeside. And then what's really cool is that when then we start to see the South Arm lake level decline again, is when we see the North Arm kind of flux overpowering the south to north flux. So how I envision it is the South Arm comes up, it begins to spill into the North Arm, which fills, and then the South Arm starts to drop. There's kind of this lag, and kind of then it begins to flow back into the South Arm. And that's what we observe in many of years in this period of record. So this was our first attempt, and I think this is what we shared with you previously. And if you recall, doing all of the accounting on this and comparing it to our rise in South Arm salt mass, which is around 100 million tons, that we were ending up with a discrepancy of around like 400 million tons, where we were estimating there was actually more salt leaving the South Arm than was coming in, and it didn't make a lot of sense. So we revisited this, if you go to the next slide, by reaching out and working with our colleagues at Utah State. So they were actively trying to estimate daily or sub-daily discharge at West Crack using USGS continuous data records of velocity and other variables. And we said, hey, can we use these, can we try them and see how this affects our salt mass salt flux estimates at West Crack? And so this is the same plot. However, now I've overlain kind of our daily salt fluxes using that new discharge data set as these kind of red dashed lines is from north to south, and the blue kind of really blue lines that are moving all over the place are from south to north. So you can see we are not capturing like basically any of the variability that actually occurs at that site. And just from being out there, we are familiar with how West Crack behaves. This is just much more in line with reality. It responds to winds, it responds to different forcings. And so this gave us a lot of confidence that, you know, it's closer to what reality is. So you can't see here, but we really want to thank Sam and his students for allowing us to use those discharge estimates. So then I think we can go to the next slide. Then another way to look at this is to look at the cumulative salt flux in millions of tons at this site. So blue is flux from south to north, and the ANN model, that's Sam's daily estimate of discharge, is the solid blue, and then our interpolated USGS measurements are these dashed lines. So south to north there, and then north to south similarly in kind of that salmon color. So what kind of blew our minds here is just how these two different discharge data sets really flipped the story completely. So if we were to use just our monthly interpolated estimates of USGS data, so these ones in dashed lines here, from fall of 2017 to present, you see the cumulative amount of mass that's past that site. It would estimate that there was over 260 million tons that had left from south to north. So much more salt leaving than coming in. However, when we use Sam's daily ANN discharge data set, the story is completely reversed, and we are now estimating that there's more salt coming in from north to south on a magnitude of about 70 million tons. So this just made so much more sense to us. We were really glad to use this, and it really hit home the idea that if we want to understand salt flux at West Crack, we need a daily discharge data set or a sub-daily discharge data set to quantify that accurately. So that's an important lesson that we were able to demonstrate and quantify here. So, and then the next one, I think kind of the next slide brings it all together. Yeah.
And I just want to, it's that uplooker velocity data that I kind of always go over quickly here. And then we also have a weather sensor out there. Those data are used to train the ANN model, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. So,
as well as wind data, wind speeds, density, and water surface elevation.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Yep. All right. So then if we kind of sum everything that's coming in and going out, here's this is what we end up with. So cumulative salt flux again in millions of tons per day, fall of 2017 to present. And I'll walk us through what each of these lines mean. So this red color, that's our north to south cumulative flux. the big blue line is our cumulative south to north flux. Lakeside is in purple. Rivers are in this dashed blue line. And then this dashed green line is kind of the net. So what's coming in north from north to south, as well as rivers, the sum of that over this time period is 708 million tons. What's going out at West Crack, south to north, and at Lakeside, 667 million tons. And then if we compare that, so that the net of that is that we're importing 40 million tons into the South Arm, which is, again, encouraging because previously we were just saying, it's all just going somewhere, and we have this massive source of salt we don't know about. So now it's much more in line with reality, but we're still missing around 50 million tons during this 5-year period. And so if we go to the next slide, we have a few ideas we explore in the paper about what those sources of salt could be. One is the return flows from mineral extraction ponds. We've done back of the envelope calculations on this using assumptions that were kind of presented in the Merck and Tarbotten paper, where 25% of the withdrawals are coming back into the South Arm. And if we do that, then we get about 35 million tons of the salt is explained over that 5-year period. So that's a lot of the 15 million ton discrepancy. But we have no idea how accurate those assumptions are.
We can provide values. I mean, I have exact values.
Right. Let's
for that, but it's not even close to that. It's an order of magnitude less.
Yeah, that would be.
We're not that good at it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I kind of so our approach in the paper has been, we can use these assumptions. We have no idea how good they are. So if we want to actually know this, we need to monitor it. And so another source would be groundwater, which folks at UGS have been quantifying. And our back of the envelope calculations with that are that it would explain maybe 3 to 4 million tons. So it is coming in, but it's not a huge source of salt relative to other sources. Another idea is salt flux through the fill material of a 30-kilometer long causeway. Got a lot of kind of length there where water could seep through from north to south. And we've looked at using hydrostatic pressure comparisons of North Arm and South Arm. We can actually see that through the majority of the water column, there is force that would drive flow from north to south through the causeway fill. So understanding the permeability of that and understanding its transportabilities would be really helpful. And then another fun source of salt could be the salt crust that's migrating from the Newfoundland Basin. So in the 1980s, during the high stand of the Great Salt Lake, they pumped like 500 million tons, if I'm not mistaken, of salt into the Newfoundland Basin area. And Brenda Bowen and her student have previously kind of documented how this salt crust is decreasing in surface area. And there's also evidence to show it's actually migrating toward the Great Salt Lake. So it's moving east and kind of potentially, the flow paths suggest that it could be getting into Great Salt Lake. So that's another source of salt that could be worth becoming curious about. And then the error. There's, because we were able to show there was such a big difference in the West Crack salt flux estimates using 2 different discharge data sets. I mean, if we can refine the discharge, I think that would be a really excellent thing to try and do, as I assume there is still error in the salt flux estimates that we have. So with that, I think I'm done. I just kind of wanted to acknowledge everyone who was a part of this. And that's on the next slide. And, oh, wait, there's one more. Sorry. Implications for salinity management. Okay, so what have we learned from this that might be relevant to this group? We argue that the existing salinity monitoring is quite robust for the South Arm. The greatest magnitude salt fluxes are occurring at the causeway breaches, particularly at West Crack, by far. That's the source of greatest internal salt cycling. And if we really want to nail this down and get accurate estimates of flux, we need daily to sub-daily discharge estimates from West Crack. And it's important to consider there may be other South Arm salt sources, but more monitoring would be needed to confirm that. So.
Christine, where on Newfoundland Basin, where the salt is potentially migrating, where is it coming into the lake at?
We think it's coming in near the lakeside gauge, which makes us wonder if it's actually not getting into the South Arm at all, because it could just be kind of routing into the North Arm. It's unclear exactly what it does when it reaches the side, but we have documented, flow events where there's really high connectivity water flowing from the north at Lakeside. So if you're at Lakeside Breach, it's kind of flowing from the north into the breach, but it's kind of unclear where it's going.
And it would, so if it's coming from the Newfoundland Basin, it would come around the southern tip of Hoggett Range and then kind of flow along that eastern shore of Hoggett. And you can see it during the spring. And then it flows north towards the causeway, and there's actually like a little drain adjacent to the toe of the causeway.
That was what I had thought as well, but there was an event this spring where I observed water coming into the south arm through that portion of the breach, and it just seems like, you know, if we're looking for simple solutions on salinity, that might be something where we can quantify that and make sure that it's in the north arm.
There is a canal that crosses the upland extension of the causeway between the causeway and Strong's Knob, and then discharges into the north arm. I'd be interested to see where you saw the south arm inflow.
Yeah. Just one other quick thought too. There's also been discussions about, you know, with how much water is out in Newfoundland Basin. There's a gentleman that has probably contacted everybody in the room, but talked about, you know, potentially making dikes or something to try to push some of that water or drain it into the north arm. I think it's a cool idea, but there would be some salinity challenges, and we'd have to think really hard about what that might do. But something to consider if we start dropping it.
And I'll just pipe in a little bit on the lake side. So we have a gauge at the lake, the westernmost breach, the lakeside breach. That gauge is, we cannot measure those really small flows coming from potentially the Newfoundland Basin and through that lakeside breach. Some of that flow it's braided. Some of it ends up just going right into the north arm, as Ben mentioned. Some of it goes through the lakeside breach itself, but it's very shallow. We have to run an index velocity. So we have an uplooker velocity meter there. We have to have enough depth to run that uplooker velocity meter in order to run a rating, a discharge rating at that site. And those really small flows, they're relatively small flows, we just can't really gauge. So the lakeside gauge is really most effective for south to north flows. As the south arm rises, we'll start seeing more flow through that lakeside gauge. We'll have enough depth for our uplooker velocity to essentially work. So I'm all with, you know, Ben mentioned, or, you know, if we can figure out a way to get all that flow coming in from Newfoundland Basin just to dump into the north arm and not have to try to quantify that flow. Going, you know, if it's going directly into the south arm, let's figure out a way to measure it. If we can avoid that, that would be a good thing. Basically, to bring all that to the north arm so that it comes through eventually through the new breach. Are there any monitoring wells up there, around there?
We have a water well
Water.
right at Lakeside, you know, pretty close to the railroad abutment there. Pretty sure it's in bedrock, but it's not too deep. But you do have some infill, you know, that are in some of those valleys around Lakeside.
Yeah.
But we did a little groundwater investigation on the Lakeside lease, Coleman lease, upland, and you do hit a pretty robust sand layer at about 20 feet that's artesian.
Salty.
Oh yeah, it's greater than South Arm concentration for the ions that we're interested in.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Remind me again, what was the number that you were missing, the unaccounted for number?
About 50 million tons over a 5-year period.
Joe, do you know off the top of your head what your discharge is?
We're on average 3 to 4 million. Good year, maybe 5
per year.
That in itself would make up half of that.
Yes.
Because it's a cumulative.
Is that annually or?
The 50 million is over. It's from about 2017 to 2022. It's roughly a 5-year period.
That's about 3 million per year.
10?
Yeah, 10 million per year.
But we had coordinated through water resources, like I had given those figures to Erica and water resources last summer.
No, I'm not saying it's wrong. I just think that that's not part of their model or what they've been discussing. So I think we need to, if we can account for that, then it just helps tell the story better.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's on that scale, and it's been 3-ish just because the Bear hasn't been flowing robustly in the past few years.
I mean, it would explain at least 30% of that.
Yeah, yeah, that'd be great. Mhm.
That's a big jump.
Yeah.
You get pretty dialed, Christine. You've almost nailed it.
It's pretty exciting to not have a 400 million ton discrepancy.
Do we, I mean, have for the South Arm Mill track,
We don't have returns.
you don't have returns.
Morton does, but I think it's just minor. Go look that up.
And we have the withdrawals, as I understand, from Division of Water Resources. We can quantify the mass that's taken out. And then kind of pairing it with Joe's estimate of what's coming back in would be really helpful. Yeah. Cool.
So I guess another follow-on question is, do we need to do, what is needed to be able to get to that daily discharge? Or sub-daily discharge measurement?
Yeah, so Sam and his, they're gonna try to develop a rating, I think, based on the new elevation. I shouldn't say I think, I mean, they're doing research now, modeling work on as the berm exists today. So based on that new elevation. So anytime the berm elevation changes, we're gonna have to continue to collect data so that he can build a rating for that berm elevation. So over time, I think he'll be able to develop ratings for different berm elevations. And so when adjustments are made in outgoing years, he'll have a rating and we can continue doing some validation type monitoring. Once all these ratings for different berm elevations are done, we can continue to do some validation monitoring to ensure that the models are holding true. I think that would be a kind of a long-term scenario that'll play out. But it's going to take time. Every time the berm elevation changes, more and more data needs to be collected.
So I don't recall it. Marissa maybe could weigh in, but I don't know if we had to send out the letters yet for awarding the tech team grants. But I know that was one of Sam's research topics, and I won't say whether we awarded it or not.
We did send out letters. So Sam has been notified.
Yeah, so some was awarded that grant, so we're looking forward to being able to model that better. And then this coming year, we also did get an appropriation for modifying the berm and being able to move forward with that. So I think as a matter of maybe like some future Salinity committee topics, we could discuss, what other measurements we would need to accurately inform that, because I think that some of that funding we could use to really dial in the data we're collecting, so we have really good informed information that we're trying to modify that in the future.
Great. Thank you. I'm just thinking, Phil, would your data fit well here?
Yeah, I think it's probably a good time.
I think just in terms, I think it's super encouraging that the measurements that you've been making, that different groups have been making around the lake are so consistent. I think that's usually with the lake, it seems like everything's different. we have things that are challenging, and so it's nice to see that here we actually have some consistency. Grades off. Yeah. And I think where this fits in is just, you talked a little bit about the 0.5 and the 3 meter or 3 meter depths, how those are consistent. I think Phil's got some based on their data sets.
Yeah. So we wanted to present some of the salinity data that we collect, because part of our routine monitoring program where we hit 9 sites across Gilbert Bay each time we go out, and we try to sample at multiple depths, and we capture salinity at those. And it's been an interesting year with all the inflow coming in. We have people around the office that'll ask us when we go out, what's the salinity out there? And this year, that's a complicated question to answer, because with all the river inflow not mixing in immediately, creating a lot of heterogeneity, the answer to that really isn't one answer. It really depends on where on the lake you're sampling, what depth you're sampling, and what date you're sampling. Next slide. So just a brief overview of our last two sampling dates. The map on the left is April 14th. The one on the right is April 26th. And those are our 9 sample locations on the lake. And this is just presenting the salinity measurements at 1 meter, which is the shallowest we collect on our program. On April 14th, the average of all those was 142 grams per liter. But if you look at the individual sites, you can see quite a bit of variability on that 1 meter salinity, depending on where you are at the lake. And some of those sites are quite far from the river inflow points, you might note. At least on this date, the lowest salinities were out by Stansbury Island and Carrington Island, which is not where the river inflows are coming in. It's suggesting that this plume of water coming in from the river inflows gets moved with currents and winds, and you can't necessarily predict where it's going to be, because on April 26, 2 weeks later, average salinity 144, a similar variability in range, but at this point, the most dilute salinities were off in the north and the far west parts of the lake. And if you look at those same salinities, same locations out by Stansbury Island, salinity is substantially higher there at 1 meter, just by random distribution across the lake and the date you choose to sample. Okay, next slide. And so there's also variability within the water column, as Christine noted. And so we have 3 deep sites on the lake. We have one in the Northwest Basin, we call that our Site 9, one deep in the Southern Basin, that's Site 6, and then one in between off of Fremont Island, that's Site 3. And so the graphs you see here are salinity profiles taken at 3 consecutive sampling dates this spring. On the y-axis, 0 is the surface of the lake going down in depth. And then across the x-axis is the salinity of those measurements. And then each set of lines is a different sampling date. And you can see there's a substantial amount of variability as you go through the water column this year. And you can see quite clearly the effect of freshwater inflows freshening the surface layers and mixing down gradually through the depth. And you can see that progression as you go from the gray line, which was March 7th, before we had this large rush of inflow. And then the salinity just keeps marching back as you go through time, even at depth. And so, John, we're talking about the deep brine layer potentially in the Northwest Basin is very clearly evident on March 7th, where salinity is over 200 grams per liter, and that's a pretty clear indicator of North Arm water that was there. But as the lake is freshened, that brine layer has declined to the point where at about 160, 170 grams per liter, it's the same as what the surface waters were back on March 7th. So it might be a remnant of some of those surface waters that just haven't mixed yet. It may not have originated from the North Arm. It's kind of hard to tell. But regardless, a gradual reduction and disappearance of the deep brine layer. Okay, next slide. And the interesting thing about that is if we contrast the spring of 2023, which are the graphs I just showed on the last slide, that's the top row here, with the same time period in 2022 when there was very minimal runoff, we can see that the heterogeneity is much greater in 2023. And so a year ago, you could reasonably sample, 1 meter, 3 meter, 5 meter at any of these sites, and you could do it in between, March 15th and May 16th, and you'd be getting about the same salinity measurement. Either way, there just was not a lot of variability with the depth or space on the lake when the river inflow was so low. This year, it's a different story, a high level of variability. Next slide, Joe. And so this set of plots are taking 2 individual sample dates. The left graph is April 26, 2023, and the right graph is April 20th, 2022. And essentially, it's just plotting all of our individual data points on that sample date according to the depth they were calculated and captured at, and then the salinity that was in that sample from all 9 sites on a given date. And so the graph on the left, 2023, we can see a substantial amount of variability. Higher variability, the shallower you are in the water column between sites. And that starts to taper down as you go down to depth. Go ahead and click, Jeff. In 2022, this circle covers what's basically considered the epilimnion, the oxygenated upper layers of the water column. Very little variability in salinity across the x-axis in 2022, regardless of which site you sampled. Again, Jeff. These data points represent the epilimnion on April 26, and you can see that depending on where you sample and at what depth, your salinity value is going to range from about 135 to 155 grams per liter. And so essentially for this year, there's a lot of variability between sites, a lot of variability with the depth, and it requires essentially a heavier sampling effort on a given date in order to have any confidence that the values you're getting are representative of what's out there in Gilbert Bay as a whole. And so, and the closer you get to the surface, the higher that variability is going to be just by the influence of that fresh water not mixing in thoroughly. And so contrasted to a low runoff like 2022, lower variability across the lake and with depth. And so it takes much less sampling effort to get a more confident estimate of what the average salinity across Gilbert Bay might be on a given date. And so as we go forward and we try to consider, was the management effective, what's the salinity of the lake at a given point in time, this is something we probably need to be pretty careful about this year with all the river inflow. Make sure that we're getting an accurate estimate of what the salinity actually is in the south arm. I think that's it.
All right, great. Any questions or discussion?
It's more about the berm. Probably going to talk about that.
Bill.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that this is consistent with some of the conceptual ideas we have about the way the lake mixes, right? Where we know that freshwater inflows kind of move into Carrington Bay first, going on the north side of Fremont Island. And, those of us who have been out there sampling it have experienced that big current coming in this time of year. And so that surface freshening makes perfect sense. The fact that it propagates southward, as well as when the deep brine layer starts coming in, it propagates southward. So when you have those transients, you get a lot more variability because you're looking across the transient. And so it just underlines, it's really good data, Phil, and it underlines the need to expand from a hydrodynamic model at the breach to a neural network or other combination of models that really give you a sense of how to simulate these transients across the bigger system. And if we can do that, then this data will not be so mysterious. We'll actually be able to predict how this variability will play out over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I think I was thinking about the discussions we've been having about the critical salinity thresholds and how does that fit into our protocol? And I think in the last, I think as we were developing the berm management protocol, one of the things that really popped in my mind or realization was that we've identified that range of salinities that was most beneficial to the uses around a lake. One of the key items that we were looking at was really, well, what is the salinity in the spring and really the first generation of brine shrimp to hatch, right? And so I think, and so that was a key point, I think, in our discussion about the protocols to where, when we measure the salinity in the spring, we want to make sure we're low enough to be able to enable that hatch, but then also to have enough buffer for the inevitable increase in salinity that we would observe over the year. So I guess looking at this data, we're seeing a lot of variability, especially in the shallow layers. And I guess the question that comes to mind is when we're looking at the spring salinity values, and comparing that against what we'd like to see for that first generation of cysts to hatch, I guess where are the cysts in the spring? Are they in that top meter, 3 meters that are observing that? So when we're measuring it seems like if we're measuring salinity during the rest of the year when we don't have a lot of inflow, the depth doesn't appear to be as important as it does when we have inflows and we have those dynamic flow patterns in the lake. So I guess the question is when we're measuring in the spring, when we want to make sure we have that low salinity, is it enough to measure near the surface? Is that where the cysts are? Or how do we characterize the salinity in the spring?
Phil, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but what we've typically seen historically is that the buoyancy of the cysts in Great Salt Lake are close to neutral buoyancy, regardless of what salinity they were produced. And we see the buoyancy, we see a lot of variability in buoyancy through a lot of different factors. So time is a factor. And that makes sense. It's cysts are metabolizing, then the metabolites change in the density of the embryo, and therefore can change what the buoyancy of the cyst is. So we're seeing the cyst throughout the water column for the most part. Occasionally, we see some cysts accumulating on the surface when they get trapped in those fresher layers of water, but for the most part, we see them throughout the water column. We also see a significant portion of cysts that tend to be benthic, at least during periods of the year. And we see these cysts that are benthic have a very similar dormancy patterns as the cysts that are in the water column, suggesting that over time, they end up mixing up, or over time, they end up in the water column. So it's a very dynamic, the buoyancy is very dynamic. It changes over time. And for the most part, we find cysts throughout the water column. Is that accurate, Bill?
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Is there a heavier population distribution in any one phase, or it's equal throughout the water column? Not just presence, I guess.
I mean, we're still trying to sort of get to the bottom of buoyancy. A lot of research on it. And it's a very complex matter. So it's, kind of difficult question to answer at this point.
But with greater salinity as of late, you've not seen more buoyancy.
Absolutely not. In fact, in the North Arm in the late 90s, when in 1999, when the division shut down the harvest in the South Arm, we went north. You could see barely any cysts on the water surface, but when we sampled, we actually found a significant amount of cysts in the water column. And that salinity was probably 25, 26%. Go bigger.
So I guess an important question as we start to talk about the protocol, think about that, it's going to be, well, when we measure the salinity, especially for those spring values, at what depth do we look at? And I think this is consistent with, when John, correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember the tag at your technical advisory group at GSLEP, you're measuring salinity. And I remember there's often a comment in the spring, your spring tag that, this might just have been a freshwater lens that was sampled. So I think that's very consistent with this.
Yeah.
And what are your thoughts in terms of, especially in the spring when we're measuring salinity, when we're trying to evaluate how things can fluctuate or change throughout the year, is what are folks' thoughts as to where we should be measuring? I guess is what it comes down to. I know we've got a great historical data set at the 1 meter shallow layer that I think we want to preserve. But I guess with this information and what we're learning, I guess what are your thoughts?
I mean, no specific thoughts yet about exactly what to use, but just generally speaking, we'd be happy to share our information. We have a pretty good historic data set as well. We did use a refractometer salinity only in the past, although we have pretty good correlation between the refractometer salinity and, density measurements in USOP that we developed, the Salinity Advisory Committee. Right now, we're still continuing our refractometer counts, but we're also adding the protocol that we developed here. We're happy to share these data, if nothing else, to see what the variability is, and because it is possible that over time, as these inflows decrease, we should start to see more homogeneity in these data. We're happy to, present that. And there might be two ways to look at it. You could try and integrate these different salinity measurements using the bathymetry, or the whole lake. We could add the half a meter that the Division of Wildlife Resources measures, which I think it's more shallow than 50 cents. It's more like 25 centimeters. We could even add that. We can add the USGS and UGS salinity and integrate it over the lake. That would be one thing, or we could just wait until we get more homogeneity in the data and take that as a point of measurement.
I would, I would align behind that sort of thinking in terms of if we want to depart from one data set or expand how we look at it, that we continue the run that we're on with this long-standing data set from multiple agencies, and with more data, if we can have better understanding of that variability and we want to depart, we'll at least have kind of a ramp up and a ramp down, with a statistically significant data set.
I think it'd be really neat to look at that, because the analysis we did and say, we think it's robust, but that's given the data we have, which is, taken twice per year, 7 sites, whereas yours is much more, vertically discrete, more measurements throughout the water column, as well as thoroughly resolute. There's many things that your data capture that ours don't. But I think it's what we make a recommendation in the paper is that this springtime, the way we're thinking about it is in the springtime, you get this huge influx of water. Our salt tariff gauge is measuring that daily, right, continuously. So it's picking that up right away. Whereas our salinity measurements we're pairing it with are delayed. It's taking a long time to mix in. And so we're likely pairing higher salinities, not yet dilute salinities, with this higher lake elevation gauge. And so we say, don't use springtime measurements to estimate the annual load. And we actually propose using a July through November estimate, maybe a mean, to compute an annual estimate of salt load in the South Arm. Another idea that has been proposed in the past is just using salt mass calculated at the low lake level in a given year. But definitely being aware of when there's more greater variability in the salinity data throughout the lake. And it'd be really interesting to compare, as Phil has done, with this year and previous years, because in my limited experience, this is a pretty extraordinary year. And so how many of these years have we seen in the past? Are we usually okay with the spring runoffs we typically have gotten in the last 10 years? I don't know. That's just a question, but having a greater, more data to work with would be a great opportunity.
But as it relates to Berm management protocol, though, the narrative is looking at what the spring, what the spring salinity is. Just from a tighter sort of management perspective.
Right, you're right. That seasonal variability matters. Yeah.
And you're really solving for what it's going to be in October, presumably when it's lowest, just to try to get, knowing that there could be a, 30 grams per liter swing.
And I think what Phil did here is he just showed two extremes in order to demonstrate this type of temporal variability from year to year. But obviously we could, look at our whole data set, come up with a more in-depth analysis. But I don't think given how we've been calculating salt mass and how USGS and our data ultimately for salt mass have been quite close, I don't think it would be a problem to take this kind of data and combine it with everybody else's data. And again, try and calculate salt mass salinity. We can go either way, I think.
Yeah.
Just to talk too, but I know we're already, we've made the recommendation for the protocol as it scans. But I think this really plays into like how we do this in the future. So if there is a way that we can start looking at the data and how they correlate, and if there's a way that we can take an average or just, have a better picture of that, or maybe we're not like, maybe we don't need to be basing it off of information during the high runoff because it's so variable, and we try to focus on before runoff and, July, August to make that decision. I don't know exactly what it looks like, but I think if we could start comparing those data, I think that'd be the way to go. Someone smarter than me, like Christine or Ryan here, could probably make good sense of it.
But wouldn't that be June though, like when the runoff stops?
It depends on the year.
Yeah,
Right?
that is a good point. You do want to get that salinity in the spring if you want to, decide on how you manage.
Because if we're planning for, the mechanics of
Exactly.
of berm management, which I know takes you time.
It's also going to depend on, like I think when runoff stops, that's one thing. But then if we like this year, if we have a 3.5 foot head difference and we're already exporting salt out, I don't think we're going to be, pulling we'll have to decide when it's appropriate to pull the berm down, right? Like to finish exporting the rest and how that works and whatnot. So I don't know what the timing would be. I was just kind of going off there.
Bill had his hand up. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, just bingo on the, you can't really forecast these decisions based on salinity during spring runoff because you have two ends of the system, right? You've got the export from the south to the north occurring as you've got this inflow coming in. But remember that depending on the berm height, we get import back from the north through the deep brine layer. And that, of course, is controlled now by the berm height. And as we've discussed before, if you let that back into the south arm and then the south arm destratifies, you end up with a much higher average salinity in the south arm than you otherwise would. And so you have to look at both ends of this, which means you can't do this in May or June. You have to do this later on in the year when you understand how much has gone to the north arm and how much could potentially come back.
So that's kind of what I was saying, and you said it much more elegantly, but I think like have some type of equation that looks at where we started at before runoff and then where we left off after we began to see the north arm leveling off, if that's happening, any given year. And of course, we have to think more about this in years that aren't extreme like this. Like I think this year, my assumption is that we'll level out on both sides eventually,
but there's probably an elevation somewhere between 92 and we showed that 87 we were pretty much blocking the north to south flow, if I recall. That's correct. Materially blocking it. I mean, there may have been some minor spillover, but in order to maintain some connection, and I mean, we're going to need to make a decision, at some point, like how much export based on the inflow. And the protocol is suggesting 10%.
Yeah, and I think that that's something we would look at. So, once that starts to level off, and so like this year, it might be more like July because there's so much water that it takes. We would have to figure out what the salinity at that point is, and then how much room we even have in the north arm. This year, there may be no room. I'm guessing that it's going to level off and we'll be somewhere in a happy medium. I don't know if you have any different predictions, but
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, I think it's spilling now and it's going to continue to rise. So at the point the south arm hits, 4195 or something like that, and it continues to spill. Well, and we're only 2 feet away and we still have like 50% of our snowpack. So, I think it's feasible. But if we do that and it continues to spill into the north arm, bring the levels up, or I would assume it's going to go faster, it'll accumulate faster than it's evaporating. So we'll continue to rise, and at some point it'll hit that 4192. Will contribute to that much water, right?
That's the question, right, Joe? I think from your perspective is how much evaporation now starts to play into that equation.
Yeah, I mean, I wish the opening was large enough. Mm-hmm. You had enough flux over that opening to provide a volume of water that's going to exceed the evaporation rate. That's unlikely. It's an unknown at this point, but I mean, you're gonna approach that equilibrium where there's nothing coming into
anecdotally, it is starting to cut into that berm. Folks have been out there recently. We're starting to get a little V notch going in the middle, so it's going to be interesting to see. It was quite a wave it was going.
I mean, not to discount this, but I think that if that was the case and it cut a V notch into it, it wouldn't be the worst case scenario because we were able to impound that water. We had that benefit of letting it mix for the spring and doing its thing. And if we needed to go in and repair that, we could. I don't know if we can do it while it's running high, but
no need right
yeah,
now.
exactly. I don't think there is either. So I think as it plays out, though, my point being is just that, come July, when we start to get a better picture of what that salinity looks like and how much room there is to export salt and water, then we'll know exactly what we would want to do. Hey, that's how I'm interpreting this protocol. I don't know if anybody else has it.
Sure. I mean, I guess, is there any sense like what the inflow is looking like? 1 million plus acre feet or?
Yeah, I don't have a good feel for that right now. But I'm with Ben. There's a lot of snow yet to come. So we'll have a much clearer picture here in 3-4 weeks. So
I just saying that. I mean, this is interesting. I've been nobody seems to have an answer to that question. But some of the things that we haven't seen that potentially, well, one of the things that's happened is cracking Willard, right? So that'll bring more water, really from the Weaver system. It's sort of coming two directions now. The other one that we really haven't seen yet, we saw on some of the early data, is stuff from the south just haven't. And that's because it's all going to Utah Lake. When Utah Lake hits compromise or before compromise, and Cottonwood starts spilling, it's going to be interesting to see what kind of inflows we get from the south. But we haven't really seen today. I mean, Goggins, what, like an average? Anyway, that those are just some interesting dynamics, but there are other things happening so much later than it normally would.
And I don't disagree that maybe this year, July is going to be more indicative just because of the probable lag in inflow, but also just the planning piece of what a release looks like for the program.
Sure. In my opinion, it has to be dynamic. They have to look at it each year and say, what were temperatures like? Would it be the peak runoff, and adjust accordingly so we're getting the best results and informing our decision on how much to lower it and whatnot.
Well, I want to make sure we've got time to talk about the SOP before we finish. But I think it makes sense to just talk about, I guess, building on this conversation is what information do we need should we start to pull together so that we can, I guess, implement this protocol this summer? Because as we've been talking about, the idea is to, calculate what the salt mass is after spring runoff. We want to look at the salinity concentration. We want to look at the salt mass in the South Arm. We want to look at how much salt we exported. I guess in this case, mostly it's exported to the North Arm during spring runoff. And then I think there's two parts to the decision is, we want to make sure that the salt mass as I guess presumably as the lake level drops during the summer and fall, that salt mass is going to concentrate and bring our salinity concentrations up. And so that salinity concentration is one of our targets that we're trying to hit in the fall. But that salt mass is very much part of that consideration. And then, a great discussion on, how that salt mass or how those salt concentrations change during the spring runoff. We wanted to try to achieve, per this protocol, we wanted to achieve a spring salinity of less than 130 grams per liter, to be protective of the spring hatch of the cysts, brine shrimp cysts, and try to set ourselves up so that we don't exceed that 160 or minimize any exceedance as much as we can in the fall. And so I guess the question I asked all of you is, well, we're already making a lot of measurements. I guess what calculations do you think we need to make over the next few months, the summer, as we get into the summer? At what point do we make that calculation, to be able to make a recommendation.
I think we're going to need to be able to predict to the best of our ability what that salt mass unload to the north arm looks like, because as I mentioned last time, you can't just move 1 million acre feet quickly.
Right.
Or 500,000 acre feet. I mean, that's half of the bear, or equivalent to the bear's inflow. So, we may need to plan for that sooner than later if that's the target, or else we're going to get behind. And then either erode into the next water year, for that release, and then degrade that opportunity, or just might need to plan for that a little bit earlier, depending on what that ideal is.
Has anybody been out to the far west? What do you call the far west for each lakeside? Lakeside. Okay. Has anybody seen how much that is flowing currently? Because I mean, it should be at this point that we should have.
It wasn't connected as of like a week and a half ago. It's crossed over, but it really hasn't pulsed. It really hasn't pulsed into the north arm.
And really, in the last 10 days, it's come up that 0.4 feet or so that it would have been.
It's probably right there, approaching that.
So I mean, that'll add another opportunity for inflows as well to the north arm as things are coming up. So we'll probably, I think at this point, we'll probably see, the south arm even slow down more as that's flowing in. But that's something we need to work into our equation too. And then you don't collect any velocity at all in there, right?
Yeah, we have.
Oh, you do. Yeah, you do. Yeah, you said that. Yeah. Is it how quickly do you get the measurements for velocity? Is it like a daily value, or it's a singular moment in time, or do you?
No, every 15 minutes. Oh, really? But we don't have enough depth there right now to get good velocity. Okay. So if you went to our real-time page, you won't see anything. So as soon as we get enough depth to get good data, velocity data, it'll be telemetered just like for the reach. Yeah.
Maybe a suggestion of.
I don't know offhand. 2 feet probably.
Maybe a suggestion is to go back to 2011, 2017. Those were big inflow years as well. Take a look at when the lake was more or less leveling off in terms of, that balance between evaporation and inflows. We take a look at that, and we might be able to find a good point in time where we could say, okay, this is a good time to look at salinity and salt mass. It may be too late, to your point, I don't know, but at least let's take a look at that data. And then maybe decide the next meeting.
I mean, just the logistical problem of determining that number in July, when you might need to open her up in August.
Right.
It feels like this committee's going to need to be meeting frequently, to kind of, really dial in and make those decisions. I mean, per the protocol that we agreed on.
How long does it take between making a decision and going out there and opening up?
Oh, I think we can do it immediately.
There you go. Yeah. So that's not an issue.
It's right now. I don't know if the railroad is going to be willing to continue to work for free, but they were pretty gracious to offer their services before, and I think they don't really want us having a contractor in their hair, so they may be willing to just do that again for us. But if need be, we do have funding available, so we'll have to go through a procurement. But I'm assuming we can get it done very like matter of a week or more, or a week or 10 days to get a contract out awarded.
I do agree with Joe that we should, at least given that we have such an extraordinary year, meet on a more regular basis. Make sure that we don't, that we try and use all the data we have, make the decisions in a timely manner.
When's our next meeting scheduled for?
I had slated, I think, suggesting June 22nd. I think.
And that might give us, that might be, I think right now we're meeting every month, which is far more than what we were meeting before. And so if we were to meet on the 22nd, I don't know if that's too long to wait, but that would give us a window into like what the rest of this runoff season's going to look like. I think we'll have a good idea of what's left in the snowpack where to go from there. And if we decided during that meeting that it was time to procure, something, or start beginning those discussions with the railroad, to do that then.
And I think I'm not here on the 22nd. Tim, are you here? June 22nd.
I think in terms of the values that we need, to be able to monitor those changes, I think, because I'm just throwing this out loud, is would it be possible to estimate the salt mass that we had at the end of the year? So let's say November, December 2022. I know you had a great series of, you did calculations and showed those at our last meeting. So if we know that that's where our salt mass was in the south arm at those water levels, and as you're tracking that salt flux with SUMS and what is that export happening since then? In theory, as the south arm is filling up, we've already seen what we expected is that salt mass is being diluted as the water level is coming up. And so if we know, that daily, if we have an estimate for the daily export of salt into the north arm, in theory, we should be able to subtract that from the salt mass in the south arm. And then I think if we can do that retroactively, these are big ifs, so tell me if I'm off base. But if we were able to do that retroactively from this fall, in terms of how that salt mass has fluctuated with the salinity, and then with the export to that salt balance, then I think, and if we can track that as we go into the next month or two, I think that right there is going to prepare us for that decision. Because, and I think even as, and Christine, the calculations you had done in terms of projecting what it might be in the fall, then it's the same mass balance exercise, I think, where we can say, okay, well, we started with a salt mass last fall, and we've exported a certain amount of that salt mass because of spring runoff to the north arm. And so now we should, in theory, have less of a salt mass when we start, I guess, the summer after spring runoff. And then that is going to help us determine what salinity do we think we're going to hit this fall when the lake drops 2.5 feet or whatever that would be. And then be able to make that projection of, okay, well, would lowering the berm materially change that? And how much do we need to be able to do that? So I think the goal that, I guess, what we've been seeing, and I think that this is why I wanted you to present your results today, is that a strong sense of our urgency was that we saw this significant increase in salt mass. And I think the measurements, and I think what we found is, the measurements and how we're computing that was, so that's great. I think a great contribution here, important. But as we look into next year and maybe be able to project as to, okay, if we hit a certain salinity this fall, do we need to increase that salt mass further? Because I think to get to where we want to be next spring, and that I think is what can influence, per our protocol, what can we do that? Try to export more salt this summer if we need to. And I think, Ben, to your point, I think on the lake level, until this north, what we're observing in the north arm, I was thinking surely this north arm is going to come up along, because we're spilling. But I think one of your slides you showed is that in previous years during the spring, we were seeing flows to the north arm of, more than 600 CFS to 1,000 CFS in the spring. And, you know, right now we're only seeing flows of 100, 130. And it'd be really interesting to see what that evaporation rate is now. And is that, you know, I mean, the 130 CFS is helping, but are we still losing more than that each day?
And we're looking into that right now. I'll be able to speak to that better next meeting. If I might raise one other sort of question, is, you know, is June 22nd a good date to meet? I guess I would say it might be good to toggle it to when the most recent data point would be available. Like, is there, based on the timing and cadence of your sample collection, just so we're looking at as recent of data as possible, since we're really trying to dial in on that wind down period. How does that fit with your?
So a lot of these measurements happen at the beginning of the month, each month, thereabouts, depending on weather. In June, though, there's at the DEQ, the sampling event that we do for DEQ, we're at 7 sites. You know, Christine showed the 4 sites, but you slip at 7 sites. June is when we do that sampling. And yeah, we should try to do it earlier in the month of June, so that by June 22nd, we've got data for 7 sites. And that's weather dependent, of course.
Anna's targeting to do it first week in June.
Okay, so
last week in May, so she's trying to get it done.
So with that, there's a decent chance of having results.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
We're supposed to go out on a boat tomorrow, but if there's thunderstorms, you know, it's been in the wash for the last 2 weeks, so.
We typically go out every 2 weeks, but again, it's, you know, driven by weather. We'll definitely bring on more recent data.
So just a kind of a dumb thought, but what are the chances that we're going to get to a point where we wouldn't want to export the maximum amount of salt this year? Like, it seems to me like we're going to want to get it down as low as we can this year, and then the real decision will be how much we bring the berm up again in the fall, because we really have room at this point. If we're trying to hit 120 to 160 in the fall, you know, we really have room enough to say that we could go down to, like, you know, say like 90 grams per liter in the south, and over the evaporation period still be within that lower end of that 120 to 160. So it seems to me like whatever we do this spring, it's going to be, let's export as much salt as we can and just try to level off those levels. And then the real decision is, come fall, how much would we want to, you know, impound water again next year? And maybe the decision is that we just don't need to bring it back up, or it stays at 4192 because things leveled and we let it take its course. But I think that to me, it just doesn't seem like there's going to be a high probability that we wouldn't want to export as much as possible. Is it anybody that?
I would agree. That almost emphasizes the fact that we probably should have went higher with the berm.
Yeah, I'm wondering if we're not fully exporting enough salt right now. We're just getting the fresh lenses that you're just diluting the North Arm, basically, which is undersaturated.
Yeah.
So should the berm be higher during this period?
In hindsight, probably yes, because what was your last measurement? 109 on the
108 or something.
Yeah. Where, you know, overall average for us was closer to, I think, 140 probably at this time, or maybe 145.
Almost like
that measurement. So yeah,
the freshwater lenses are just curving right around the causeway and then just entering to the north. And is it really doing us good by diluting the South Arm, or is it just?
Well, I think it did us good, and that we went as high as we did.
You're saying it's bleeding in through the causeway, through the forest causeway?
No, just coasting along the causeway. And then
it's bypassing the mixing.
Had it been at 4187, it would have been about the entire time, right? Not having a chance to mix. So sure, there's a benefit. And back in February, you know, it was like, I don't think anybody thought it was going to be.
We didn't know.
The year. So yeah, but in hindsight, you know, if we really wanted to have the most impact, it would have been like probably going up even higher.
But going back to Tom's idea of looking back at those wet years and seeing what those predicted salinity ranges would be, I mean, I think that would be a good lesson for us.
Well, and also I had a little side conversation. I think also trying to figure out when the velocity measurements began to occur in the breach, and if there were some velocity measurements that we could glean on when we were, leveling off back when the breach was open, and then also those high years looking at, at the other velocity measurements there at Lakeside. That'd be interesting to see if there, what the flow rate looked like through there. We could get some other additional details.
Great. So I guess I'm trying to make a list of some of the action items here or ideas that we've had. One is, wanting to look at the salt mass, starting with what Christine, with what you calculated last fall, and then trying to track that through, try to maintain that salt mass, updating that through the summer, see how that is changing and adding that export number to it. So I think that's one key thing that we need, because really all it's going to come down to that salt mass calculation.
I will say I'm not positive if SOM has estimates of daily discharge with the Berm modifications. I'll ask them, okay. But hold on that one. Set expectations. I'm not positive when his discharge estimates end.
Ryan, when did you say you're going to deploy the new sensor?
So the new Nortec is already out.
Oh, it's already out.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we deployed it on April 19th. I think something like that.
Gotcha. So then we wanted to look at kind of retroactively looking at 2011 and 2017 to how did the salinity and the salt mass change, through spring runoff and summer to kind of validate our hypothesis of, what we're thinking.
How much time does it take for dilution to impact lowering salt, regardless if it's leaving the system? But just
so I guess, Christine, can you, in terms of this, sorry to volunteer, but like with the salt mass calculation that you had, if we can keep a running total there, and then, is there a way that we can then look at 2011 and 2017, those salt mass values?
I think we had the salt mass balance for those periods, so at least from 2011, 2017.
Yeah, we have less depth resolution.
Okay.
During those years, but we can look at that balloon and sure decide when it starts becoming more homogeneous.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think just looking at what's the lag period, with the dilution in the spring and then where it stabilizes in the fall or summer. And, Bill, could you look at that? Just the 2011, 2017. I think that'll be very helpful, just to understand that. And then perhaps it isn't as urgent, but I think with what you presented, Bill, looking at your historical or analysis of your historical data and how the salinity fluctuated with depth and spatially. Because I think we're trying to get, one of the key elements we're trying to get at is when we look at the salinity concentration in the spring, where should we be measuring? When should we be measuring? The salt mass is going to probably be the critical item in terms of the berm, how we make those decisions on the berm management. But I think in terms of performance criteria, I think the salinity concentration is the key measure.
I mean, the historical analysis may take us a little bit more time.
Right.
And maybe we can focus on some of the big inflow years. Bill, do you think, and at least bring that to the salinity advisory committee? We'll see what we can get done. And definitely we can bring what then will be our most recent data.
Great.
We'll start having discussions with the Bow Road as well, to get it on their docket, see if they're going to be willing to, reduce that height or what we need to do on there. And then if they seem like they're not going to be able to do that for us, we'll begin drafting the procurement and leading some links. And we'll make sure that that's ready to go. So if the committee decides that it's time, that we can act quickly.
Perfect.
Ben, how much funding did you get for berm modifications?
So we asked for $500,000, and that was to cover any additional data that needs to be collected, as well as the actual procurement itself.
And that's what you got?
Yes.
Great. I guess any last items there?
And I'll look at the evaporation rate relative to inflow.
How do you guys measure that? Do you have a weather station up there? Or?
Yeah, we do the pan evaporation on the west side.
Pan, okay. Simple enough. Yeah.
Good. Let's see. Oh, I did not.
Real quick though, back to Joe's question. So we should have all the data we need though by the 22nd, like your collections and whatnot should jive with that meeting date.
So we can coordinate with Flux so they can get their samples done. Water committee.
Yeah.
So I think that the thought is that we'll meet on June 22nd and review those mass calculations, salt mass calculations, so we can just continuously test our hypothesis that the salt mass, if anything, should be declining because we're exporting some to the North Island, and then we'll have a kind of a running projection of how will that salt mass result in a study this fall when the lake drops back down, and then I think if the lake comes back up to 4192, which is where the berm is, and see if that helps that dilution get us closer to our target. So, I wanted to just touch on, I guess, give you an update on the SOP. I guess Phil originally identified that we had a mistake on the equation of state in the SOP. Andrew looked into that and found that, hey, we can make a quick change to that, and without having to go through a whole process. And so he has already made that change to the equation of state in the SOP that's online. There's a note there that it's been updated for that. And then, so that, I think it took care of the immediate, what I think I saw as the immediate need. I think then the second need that we had was he wanted to be able to address the fact that the equation of state analyses have been largely completed and show that the range of salinity or densities are higher than what the SOP indicated. So we wanted to let people know, whoever's using the SOP, that they can use that equation of state, continue to use that equation of state. And then I think the second item was really, we wanted to point out that we cannot just move a decimal when we're converting between percent salinity and grams per liter. And I kind of liken it to how we, when we're using meters and feet, it's very convenient to say, if I have 300 meters, I have 300 yards, and therefore I have 900 feet. But if you do the math, that difference between 3 feet and 1 meter adds up. And I think it's the same. We see the same kind of effect here. Is we're just making those quick conversions. It's convenient. It gets us in the ballpark, but in reality, it's not accurate. And I think it's important in the SOP that we make that note. And so what I circulated to the committee, I think Christine had made some great clarifications here. But really the key here is we wanted to update that the equation of state really gets us to a higher level of use. There's a lot of the North Arm observations that we make. And so she had some great edits there in terms of how we apply the equation of state. The equation of state obviously is corrected. And then I guess the caution on percent salinity is just, and really what it comes down to is that if it was a perfect world and the Great Salt Lake density was 1 gram per milliliter, which often freshwater is, then yes, we can move the density or move the decimal. But Great Salt Lake is not freshwater, and so we can't. And so, you know, we have an equation here, you know, to convert, you know, from percent salinity to grams per liter. I guess the box needs to be stretched down lower. But Andrew brought up a really good question as to, you know, is that helpful, or is it more helpful to have the equation start at grams per liter and convert to percent salinity? And I was thinking that, I know like wildlife resources, you know, when we're using a refractometer, we're measuring that reports a percent salinity. And so if people are picking up that data as a percent salinity, then now they have a way to calculate the grams per liter. But I think Andrew brought up that the challenges that we've had are when people are looking at a grams per liter, and you know, and these are usually people that are without the background, the technical background of Great Salt Lake, they're taking that grams per liter and kind of making their own conversion and then line percent. And so I guess that was one question there for you all. What are your thoughts there? Is it trivial? You know, they can figure it out. Which one do you think is more helpful?
I just wonder, what is the easiest way for the general public to digest that without compromising the actual validity of the number? And that's all.
Right.
Yeah. But to your point, it gets really squishy when, you know, just kind of offhand turn it into a percentage.
Right.
Yeah.
In my experience, it seems like the general public they basically take the number. Like if we say the healthy range is, or the ideal range is 120 to 160, and it's 140, they're like, oh, cool, we're good. Yeah. Or if it's 12 to 16%, you say it's 14, then they're cool. And they probably, like most folks, wouldn't dig too deep into that.
Right.
But I do think having that equation go both ways has some value, because like if John's team does it in percentages and we want to make sure that we're using his data and we want to convert it into grams per liter, I think it's good to be able to do that, and vice versa. So I don't know. I mean, consistency is awesome, but it might be pretty hard to get everybody using the same terminology.
Well, it's easy enough to stretch the box and add the other equation going the other way too.
I think you bring a good point up though. I mean, the general public, I think, probably has an understanding of what seawater is, and it's been percent salinity. That would be the sort of first toggle point. And the general, I think it's just in those terms.
Yeah.
Good news is it's all metric.
Well, I think, you know, part of, I think Ben's point is, too, is about how we communicate the data to the public. And in some regard, we can kind of train or shape the conversation and the direction that it should go. I think, you know, what this committee has learned is it's measuring salinity is very complicated. I mean, even the temperature of the water makes an impact on the value that we come up. And so as we're trying to get more accurate in how we measure and report our values, so we can be able to make more accurate, better decisions, you know, we need to stay on that gram per liter track. And to that end, you know, I think if we continue to report values in grams per liter, and I think if we say, you know, the healthy range is 120 to 160, and people can kind of see where we are there, then that can help. I think, if people want to compare it to other systems, like the ocean, we know the lake isn't the ocean. And I think that's just part of the education process. So I guess any other, if you had a chance to review those comments I sent out, the changes, any other concerns or any other changes that we should make?
Just real quick, apart from the Salinity conversation and how we report on that, has everybody seen the converter that Craig has? I think that would be interesting to see how well it plays in, and if it's, if others like give that some tests and see if it has any holes in it. Because so far, it looks good to me, and I think that's a quick way to do those conversions. If like the media or the general public wants to hear a percent, you're talking grams per year. Maybe we can talk. I don't know. I think that's pretty cool. If Craig wanted to share that, if anybody hasn't seen it.
I think I included that in my email.
Oh, perfect.
To everybody. I think, it's very slick.
Yeah.
So it'd be great to play with it and check it against values that we have. I haven't.
Kyle did something similar for us, and just that's what I'm using it as a cheat sheet now. So just so I am consistent with what everybody does. But
Now, that was a great tool. I think that we can, if we were to have be able to include that where people can easily access it, something like that, then along with an SOP like this.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess not hearing anything else, I will add that second equation to convert the other way as well to this box, and I'll have somebody make sure that my equation is right. I think Christine and Andrew and Phil we were bouncing things back and forth just to make sure that that's correct. And but would that be okay then to create new? I guess what I can do is we can make those changes. I don't know that there's a huge rush, and then maybe at the next meeting we can vote on formally adopting that. So. Great. Very cool. Oh, Bill.
Yeah, I almost hate to ask this, but the units you have in that box for density where you have dual units separated by a comma, does everybody feel confident that won't cause confusion? Or would it be better to just have one of those units and carry those through so that I'm just a little bit worried that that's going to throw some people.
Oh, down here in the equation.
I think he's got a great point. That could probably cause confusion.
Miles per milliliter,
or whatever you guys think. One or the other. Grams per cent.
Grams per centimeter.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, great point. Well, I'll make that change too. Great. Well, I think, in terms of action items, we talked about those. I will summarize our discussion today and make sure I highlight what those action items are for our next meeting on June 22nd. And I think one thing I guess also want to start, we'll see if we have time at the next meeting, but we want to start pivoting and just starting to rethink, kind of pick up our conversation that we had to abruptly stop last fall, which is, well, how do we develop a long-term management plan for Salinity? What gaps do we have? What modeling do we need to do to try to be able to, be able to more accurately predict this and be proactive in these decisions? And I think that conversation, I think, is very pertinent to, I think you're probably all aware of the Basin Integrated Plan that the state's developing, because and I'm working on that effort too. And definitely want to get this committee's input on what you think are the key gaps in numbers that we have, information, modeling, studies that we need to complete to be able to make better decisions. And kind of, I guess, the bottom line is that, I think one of the key decision policymakers are trying to evaluate is where should that water level be, and how much water do we need to be able to get there. And so I don't think there isn't a number. I think it really comes down to a value proposition. What are the costs? What is the value of the services that the lake provides at different lake levels? And because on the other side in the watershed, there's a cost, there's a value to the water that's being, decisions that are being made there as well. And so I think in the end, there's going to have to be somebody, at a much higher pay grade or level of power is going to have to make some difficult decisions, in terms of how do we balance all of these different needs. And so, when I reduce it all, it's kind of the Great Salt Lake water level matrix, but reduced, how we get to this, that cost or value curve at different lake levels is the trick. But if we can reduce it to a curve where we can now look at what is the cost when the lake is really low or where we prefer, then now we can make a better informed decision as to what are we trying to trade off here. So that's, but I think, salinity is obviously a very important concern, especially when the lake is low and there's costs associated with that. And so how can we better characterize those costs or the value of higher salinity? And what information, what tools do we need to be able to manage the salinity, manage the lake at these levels? So I guess that's a little bit of a teaser just to think about, but we want to get your input on these questions. And Great Salt Lake in and of itself is super complicated in terms of all the different uses and how they affect. And what we're working on now is really the plan for the plan. So we're trying to identify, well, where are the gaps? How do we prioritize the studies that need to be done so that the state can make decisions, and as we move forward. And eventually, 2026 is when the integrated plans due. That's when the recommendations will be part of that plan. So trying to prep for that and trying to think through what do we need to know to be able to make those decisions. So, but that fits perfectly in line, I think, with the long-term management plan that we've been talking about. It fits very much in line with what Ben was talking about with the comprehensive management plan for the lake. They all are kind of trying to do the same thing. We want to make sure we're not duplicating efforts, but make sure that they're all in line.
So our CMP will also have a little bit of a tighter timeline than the 2026 date, hopefully. So I would hope that we will also have some good progress on a salinity management plan, and I expect that to be somewhat of a living document. So as we learn more, we can adapt and change, but we'll have to figure out how to incorporate that into our CMP. But I do think this is probably the body to come up with that plan. So we do.
Great. All right. Well, I guess with that, I have a motion to adjourn. So move.
Second.
No objections. Thank you, everybody.
Can I just mention on Tuesday evening from 6 to 8:30, we have our Doyle Stevens program at the Wasatch Community Garden on South So Ben is providing a presentation on this very complex and complicated conversation as far as the berm and salinity. But come if you're free. You get to hear the future of those researchers who are committed to, providing additional insights to what we're talking about. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, everybody.
See you next